Right, Mr. Brennan, I think we're about ready to go here.
Terrific. Well, good morning. Thanks for gathering this morning. We have a very special guest today. Business leader, change agent, explorer, foodie, idea generator, investor, technologist, writer, global soul. In some ways, our speaker this morning defies definition. Juan Enríquez not only has many interests, but also many areas of expertise. And perhaps what makes his insight so remarkable is the way in which he combines his proficiency in these various fields to pose unique insights into the workings of our world and what we might anticipate in the future. Mr. Enríquez is the managing director of Excel Venture Management, a life sciences venture capital firm and the founder of Biotechnomy. He's also an affiliate of MIT's Synthetic Neurobiology Group. He teaches about the economic and political impacts of life sciences, about future brain technologies, and about the rise and fall of countries. He was a founding director of the Harvard Business School Life Sciences Project, and he also ran Mexico City's Urban Development Corporation. He was a peace negotiator in Chiapas, Mexico, and a member of the Sorcerer II Global Ocean Sampling Expedition, which doubled the known genes from all species. As I said, defies definition. Mr. Enríquez has been prolific on TED and TEDx talks, stages all around the world, speaking on topics as broad-ranging as your online life, permanent as a tattoo, to what will humans look like in 100 years. His talks have drawn tens of millions of viewers. Finally, Mr. Enríquez is the author of several best-selling books focused on both biological and technological evolution, on political polarization, and on the ethical choices we face related to these topics now and in the years ahead. His most recent book, titled Right, Wrong, looks closely at how technology transforms our ethics and what the implications of that will be in the future. This morning, he continues a long line of impressive individuals who have shared their wisdom with us as part of RL's Wyner Lecture Series. The Wyner Lecture, established in 1985 by Jerry Wyner, class of 1943, and his sister, Elizabeth Wyner Mark, is a living memorial to their father, Rudolph Wyner, class of 1912. Past speakers in the series include historian and author Doris Kearns Goodwin, Schindler's List Holocaust survivor Rena Finder, Billy Shore, founder of Share Our Strength and the No Kid Hungry campaign, Mark Edwards, founder of Opportunity Nation, Dr. Iqbal Dhaliwal of MIT's Jameel Poverty Action Lab, and last year, alumnus Bo Mankiti, class of 95, who spoke about real estate investing for the greater good. We are happy today to continue shedding light on important social issues through the Wyner Lecture. We're honored to have with us this morning, tuning in from home, several members of the Wyner family, including Jerry Wyner, class of 1943, as well as his son and daughter-in-law, James and Yang Wyner, parents of Oliver, class 2. We're grateful for their ongoing support of this lecture series. We're grateful also to John Werner, himself an early Wyner lecturer and father of Javi, class 1, and Mateo, class 6, for originally introducing us to Mr. Enríquez. Please help me welcome to Roxbury Latin this morning, Juan Enríquez.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to talk about something that seems so obvious that you really don't need to talk about it, which is right, wrong. And as you're thinking about right, wrong, we're going to have this talk as adults. And what that means is they're going to be difficult topics. There's going to be stuff that may bother you. There may be stuff that you disagree with. If any of you feel that you don't want to take on subjects because these are tough days, and these are days that are very polarized, then please feel free to drop off. No harm, no foul, because there isn't an easy answer on right and wrong, especially these days. So let's get straight into that. The thing that I want you to think about is maybe you're right today, but what happens if the rules change over time? And as you're thinking about that, what if what's okay today may be wrong tomorrow? What if it flips 180 degrees and the rules that you're taught today turn out to be completely wrong tomorrow? So think about this in terms of a time machine. Time machine takes you back, and you go back to the time of the Mayas, And it turns out that the Mayas practiced human sacrifice, as did the Aztecs, as did a series of other people. And not only was that considered right, it was considered essential to the survival of that civilization, because otherwise the sun wouldn't rise or the rains wouldn't come. And of course, in retrospect, we look at this and we say, what a barbaric set of customs to take an obsidian knife and cut somebody's living heart out. It's easy to think, okay, well, that was back then, but not that long ago, in the fanciest places in Paris, they used to cut people's heads off using a guillotine. And not only did they cut people's heads off, but they didn't hide it. They made it a giant party. So on weekends, people would take their kids and they would dress up in, their finest and go watch somebody get their head chopped off. And then they would show the head to everybody. And again, this is a pretty horrible, violent image. And we look at that and we say, who were these people? And how could they have been so violent? And why did they think that this was okay? And why was the rule of law considered to be okay at this time? And again, that wasn't that long ago in the fanciest, most scientific, most advanced society in Europe at that point. This is particularly relevant to me because I went to this church specifically every morning from first grade through sixth grade for Mass from 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. And they taught me a lot of things. And one of the things they taught me in this church is that you should not be and you should not respect anybody who's gay. And that was just a given. And the preacher told me that, and the teachers told me that, and the kids on the playground, they made it very explicit. My parents, the law, the newspapers, everybody around me told me that being gay was just an awful thing. And I grew up to be a little bigot because that's what I was taught. And then I went to a fancy high school, not unlike this one in the United States, and nobody talked about this. In fact, it was 15 years after I graduated from Andover that there was a tiny little announcement in the school newspaper that said, Gay Student Association meeting, all welcome. Tiny little thing in the school newspaper. That's 15 years after I left, and that was the second oldest private gay student association in the United States. So it took a long time for this to be an open discussion. And it wasn't until I got to college and met a wonderful guy called Ben Schatz, who explained to me that there were other ways of looking at sexuality. There were other ways of looking at people's choices, of looking at people's lives, and began to pull me out of my very biased structure. I had a completely different notion of what was right and wrong. And by the way, my journey is not unique. This man has also been on a similar journey. So, you can be Catholic, you can not be Catholic, you can be religious, you can not be religious. You can agree with a lot of the positions the Pope takes or not agree with them. But it's hard to argue this is a person who spends all of his day thinking about morality and right and wrong. And he may come to conclusions that you disagree with, but he thinks about this stuff an awful lot. And when you look at this man's history, when he was cardinal in Argentina, he sent a letter to the Carmelite nuns, basically saying marriage equality, marriage between same sex, is a destructive attempt towards God's plan. Pretty definitive. 3 years later, as Pope, he gives a famous interview on an airplane and says, if someone is gay and searches for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge? And that wreaked havoc among his convocation, because a lot of his senior-most people had been brought up like I was to think that this was an awful thing, and they hadn't had the experiences or the exposure or the opportunities I had. And a lot of people in the countries where he has followers have laws seriously penalizing same sex. So this was, for him, quite a brave position to take, because he was way out ahead of his leadership and his flock. but he thought that was the right thing to do. The United States has been on a similar journey. So when you ask people about gay rights, about other rights in 1997, about 2/3 of the United States opposed it and said, no, that's the wrong thing to do. They were in a position similar to the one that I was in when I was in 5th grade. Fast forward a few decades, and now it's flipped 180 degrees on the majority. So now 2/3 is in favor of it, and in fact has become very militant about it. So for those people who maintain beliefs that they were taught when they were very young, they are getting their businesses boycotted, they're being attacked on X or Y or Z for holding beliefs that they were taught by their parents or their grandparents or their church or a series of other people. The point in this thing is you can be brought up to think something is absolutely right and have it flip on you, and have it flip on you in an extraordinary way. One of the things that I would like you to think about is that technology often changes what we think is right and wrong. So there's a debate between technology, and often people think of technology as something that is the Terminator and evil and horrible, and there's two sides to that. The first is certainly you can use technology for evil. Certainly there have been nasty consequences to many technologies. But I'd also like you to consider the idea that technology gives us choices and opportunities we've never had before. And in doing so may improve our ethics and may change our notion of right and wrong. So take one of the hottest topics of the moment, a topic which is incredibly painful, which is the whole topic of slavery, of serfs, of indentured servitude. There isn't a person on this call that thinks it's okay to enslave other human beings. In fact, everybody on this call recognizes it is absolutely barbarous, unjustified behavior. So if all of us know that, the question that is interesting to me is, why did we tolerate this for thousands of years across civilizations? Because it wasn't just the US South that practiced this, the US North practiced this, and Britain, and France, and India, and China, and India, and Russia, and the Mayans, and the Aztecs, and the Incas. It's actually really hard to find civilizations that didn't practice some form of serfdom, indentured servitude, or slavery. So how is it possible that all of us know that it is absolutely barbarous, wrong behavior? And for millennia, across so many countries, people didn't realize that and act in consequence. And then there's a second question, which is also a really important question, which is legal slavery. And I understand there are still people enslaved today. And I understand there are still people mistreated in extreme ways today. But it's very hard to find a country where that is legal behavior. In fact, the legality of slavery went away in a relatively short period of time in the 1800s, decades. Part of that was because some very brave abolitionists put their lives on the line. So Harriet Ward Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Harriet Tubman, a whole series of people said, look, this is absolutely wrong. There may be a second factor as to why slavery went away besides the bravery of the abolitionists and people speaking out. And that may have to do with energy and industry and technology. See, each barrel of oil has a lot of energy in it. So each barrel of oil basically contains 5 to 10 years of a person's labor. And so when you burn a barrel of oil to take you to Cape Cod or to take you to New York or whatever, you're powering and using the equivalent of, I don't know, 1,000 people, 1,500 people, when you're burning those gallons of gas. And when you put those into a machine, then all of a sudden you've got thousands of horsepower at your disposal. And let me give you a view of what this did. It took a global economy, which was basically flat for almost 2,000 years, in fact, for 10,000 years, where there was no increase in what we produced, and it exploded. So all of a sudden we could produce massive amounts of wealth without having to enslave hundreds of thousands or millions of people. In fact, we could emancipate millions of people and have a much stronger economy because the energy, the work was being done by the gasoline, the oil, the machines. And I want to stress here, this in no way justifies treating human beings as slaves, as serfs, as indentured servants. It was absolutely wrong what they did back then, right? No question. But it did start to go away globally in Brazil, in Mexico, in China, in India, in the US, in Britain, when you started having energy and machines. Here's what happened to global lifespan. People used to live on average between 25 and 35 years. And all of a sudden across continents, you could treat people better and lifespan exploded. And it exploded on all continents. So you suddenly had a situation where you could produce more, you could do the right thing, you could be generous to people, and you could do better. And that is a situation that we may see time and again. So when you think about burning oil or burning coal, as solar becomes faster, better, cheaper, we can have more energy and not have to burn coal. And we're going to be judged pretty harshly as global warming takes hold by future generations who are going to say, why in the world didn't you use solar? Why in the world didn't you use geothermal? Why were you burning coal? How dare you have done that? You were completely amoral in what you were doing. So the point is, technology is exponential. Technology changes ethics. And ethics and our concept of what's right and wrong may start to change at exponential rates. And things that we think are right today may end up being completely wrong tomorrow. And things we think are wrong may end up in your generations being completely normal and natural. Take this product. So a synthetic burger cost about $230,000 in 2013. And not surprisingly, there were not a lot of people eating synthetic burgers. 2015, it cost $30. Yesterday at Trader Joe's, $7. So as this cost curve starts to come down, as synthetic meat tastes the same or better, as you start to outsell normal hamburgers at Burger King with synthetic burgers, all of a sudden the concept of killing 6 billion animals a year becomes a concept that you really begin to question because you begin to have alternatives to it. And so sometimes when I or your grandpa or your grandma or whoever goes out on date night to some of the fanciest restaurants in town, steakhouses, they walk past racks of bloody meat. And, you know, they just walk past it and they smile and they pick out a steak. This is not a picture that's going to age well. This is not something that when you have faster, better, cheaper alternatives to live animals is going to look too good in one generation or two. And yes, there have been vegans, there have been vegetarians, there have been people who've been at the leading edge of this, but the majority is not there yet. And the majority may flip 180 degrees and may become very militant on this when you have a faster, better, cheaper alternative. And things that we consider normal and natural today, like the 4th of July cookout and those pictures of, you know, dad grilling something, those may become very controversial pictures. Things like gene editing. So today it's a scandal if somebody goes and edits a baby. And, you know, how dare you go and do that? But again, as these technologies become faster, better, cheaper, as they become more established, you could see a conversation, maybe even with one of your children, where they're saying, you know, grandpa and grandma were so primitive that they didn't bother to edit me as a baby. And because they didn't edit my genes as a baby, I have some of the genes that cause cancer. And so I have to go into cancer treatments because my superstitious backward parents didn't bother to edit me. And again, you can see a flip, a potential flip of 180 degrees on subjects that we would say today, don't do this. How you give birth may change. You're starting to see the ability to bring animals to term outside the body. It may be that you can have a pregnancy without carrying an embryo in your body. And again, this is something which a lot of us would say, yuck, but it may be something that 1 or 2 generations from now, people say, well, you know, that's normal and natural, right? And we've seen that with things like in vitro fertilization, where you can conceive a baby without 2 bodies ever touching each other or being in the same room, which our grandparents would find miraculous and weird. And a lot of us find maybe a normal procedure. Because technology changes ethics, in these very polarized times, when we accuse people of being on the wrong side, it's really important to bring back words into our debate, into our polarized discourse. And those words are humility and forgiveness. And it's incredibly important to have humility and forgiveness because we may be wrong. And even if we're right, the concept of being right and wrong may shift. So when we judge the past, when we judge each other, when we talk to each other, when we accuse each other, let's be a little more careful to isolate the 1% or 0.5% of people who are truly evil and nasty from the vast majority of people who may have different thoughts than we do, different opinions than we do, were brought up in a different way than we do. We may not agree with them, they may not be right, but they're trying to do in general the right thing. They're trying to teach their kids what they think is right and wrong. They're trying to put food on the table. They're trying to do in the concept of trying to be a good person what they understand to be a good person. And that doesn't mean everybody is, right? But what's really dangerous is to say 50% of the population is X, Y, Z, and to polarize the extent we did. This is an especially important lecture for me because, as we heard, the person honored in this lecture graduated in 1912 and graduated right into one of the nastiest conflicts human beings have ever had, where warfare went from being a nasty thing fought in the open to being trench warfare, and these trenches were hideous. And you were in the German trench or you were in the English trench or the French trench. And it was technology that put you there. It was the machine gun that put you there. And it created a no man's land. You entered no man's land, you died. Right? You retreated from the trench in the other direction, they shot you as for being a deserter. So you were trapped in these trenches and there was no place to go. And it was this side or that side. And in a very strange way, that's where politics and a lot of our discourses ended up. We're in this trench or we're in that trench. You're this or you're that. And if you're that, then you're automatically a bad person. There's nothing to discuss with you. And you start shooting at these folks with social media or with accusations or with protests or anything else. And if you take the position, I know right from wrong, I am right, and if you disagree with me on anything, you don't leave any space for discussion, tolerance, evolution, or learning. And that's incredibly important because when you're certain that I'm right, that we are right, it also creates a great deal of insecurity. What if I say something wrong? What if I said something wrong 10 minutes ago, 10 months ago, 10 years ago? What if somebody finds out and burns me at the stake through tweets? There's a great deal of intolerance out there. And there's a great deal of polarization. You can take the most polarized, difficult subjects today, like Black Lives Matter, and we support the police. And when you poll people, 67% support Black Lives Matter and 31% support defunding the police. But as you drive around our neighborhoods, you will see one sign or you'll see the other on your lawns. You very rarely see the two of them because we're so polarized into these trenches. And that's why protest signs like this are so interesting to me and so important. Because in these highly polarized times, it is possible to be absolutely outraged and condemn George Floyd's murder and not condone looting and riots and support not all police officers, but good police officers. And again, this is a topic that's especially near and dear to me because, again, having grown up in Mexico, I know what it's like in a society where the police becomes completely corrupt, completely ineffective, and the country's taken over by drug lords. You do not want to live in a society where you do not have good police. On the other hand, you do not want to live in a society where the police abuses its powers. So this nuance in the debate is just incredibly important because even you may not always know right from wrong. The bottom line on this, when you judge the past, when you talk about what people were doing in the past, judge them with a little bit more kindness and hope your descendants are going to do the same thing. Because the rules change, they change over time. And my plea to you is get a group of friends together. Get maybe the uncle or the cousin or somebody you disagree with and talk about right and wrong and talk about why you may have different opinions and talk about how that may even change over time and do so with a little bit more humility and forgiveness. And I will stop there and take any questions, rebuttals, accusations, whatever you wish.
Mr. Enríquez, thank you so much. There's so much food for thought there. We're so grateful to have you with us this morning. So I just remind anyone with us that you can submit questions through the Q&A at the bottom. If you don't mind, I'm going to start with a question of my own. And that is, you talk a lot about evolution in a lot of different ways. And one of those being evolution of beliefs over time, whether that's societal beliefs or personal beliefs in some cases. So this is a sort of a personal question, but how do you go about, and how have you in your life gone about testing the beliefs that you grew up with? How do you recommend others might go about testing those beliefs that have sort of been innate?
You know, these, I rarely talk about, you know, some of the deep hurt of the last 4 years, because I normally spend time in science. But look, when you're called Juan Enríquez and a presidential candidate launches his campaign coming down the escalator of a fancy building in New York, stating that every Mexican is a murderer and a rapist, that was very jarring to me because I had, you know, this vision of an arc of history, an arc of right and wrong, of things being sometimes awful but getting better, and that really jolted me. And the election really jolted me, and I understand there are people who have very different views politically than mine. I have, you know, relatives in Michigan who do. But when they started taking kids deliberately away from their parents and putting them in cages and losing the parents, it reminded me of one of the most horrendous incidents in US history, which is when during World War II, they took everybody who was Japanese American and threw them into internment camps. Except it was worse because at least in World War II, they kept the kids together with the parents. And here they separated the kids and parents, they put them in cages and they lost the parents. And that is stuff which I watched happen in Chile with the guerrillas who ran those governments as generals. and in Brazil and in Chile and in Argentina. And I left Mexico under death threats because I wanted to reform that government. And so watching that in the States was just horrendous. And sometimes it was hard to talk to my relatives on 4th of July in Michigan because they are decent, honest, hardworking people who want to do the right thing. And somehow we ended up in a society that allowed a lot of people to not oppose, not be in the streets on behavior which is a violation of human rights of the most fundamental sort. So I tend to be an optimistic curmudgeon, but that's part of what led me to write this book on ethics. And there's a flip side to it, which is a professor that I loved at Harvard, who I worked with, ended up at Yale, and his wife sent an email to the students saying, "You've been asking me for guidance as to what costumes we can wear at Halloween. You're all adults. Pick your own costume." And that led to really nasty protests. How dare you not condemn this costume or that costume or that costume? And when the husband came out to defend his wife at a demonstration, they spit in his face. And, you know, part of what we need to do in these debates is to take on subjects in our high schools, in our colleges that are scary as hell for faculty, for parents, for other people, because they are so dangerous, because they are so polarized, because there's so much anger out there. But if we don't talk to people who think differently than we do, and I'm not talking about the 1% who are the truly evil people, you have to isolate those. You can't lump them together with the other 50%. But if we don't create campuses where we can have people who can disagree, if we don't have campuses where you don't get burned at the stake because you have a different opinion from somebody or you said something stupid, if we don't forgive each other, what we're going to do is we're going to rip this great nation apart. 3/4 of the flags, borders, and anthems in this world did not exist a few decades ago. We are now talking about separating the Scots, the Welsh, the Catalans, the Northern Italians, the Corsicans. I do not want to see an untied states of America. I think this is a great country. And that's why I take on subjects which are really tough and dangerous to talk about.
Thank you very much. I have a question here from a student, and it's sort of along those lines. It's a question from Lucas Numa, and his question is, how has social media polarization affected right-wrong discussions in our country today? I know you've alluded to that a little bit. Is there anything more specific about social media that you want to share?
So look, from the viewpoint of an old guy who grew up before there was the internet and Google and TikTok and Facebook and all this stuff, I'm very scared for my kids. I'm very scared for you. And I'm very scared because I had the opportunities to make a whole series of mistakes and say incredibly stupid things. And most of that's been forgotten. The problem with social media today is it's almost like you getting a tattoo. So once you get a tattoo, hard to erase. But an ink tattoo you can cover up. An electronic tattoo, because it's on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, can be reproduced for a long time. And so opinions you hold and express when you're 12 or when you're 14 or when you're 16 or when you're 20 or when you're 30 can come back a few weeks later or a few months later or a few years later and haunt you. And there's no context for having said the context of this word or the meaning of this word completely changed. How you use this word completely changed. And the meaning of words really does change over time. The meaning of actions changes over time, depending on context. And so when you're covered with electronic tattoos, if you don't establish a culture where we are more forgiving of one another and the stupid things that we thought last year or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, it becomes harder and harder the more you get electronically tattooed. And so what I'd say to you is think carefully about what you're posting. Because even if it's the right thing today, if the meaning of the word changes, it will be misinterpreted in 100 years or 200 years, or maybe in 10 months. And we have all these labels we put on one another. And, you know, maybe I'm supposed to be called Mexican. Maybe I'm supposed to be called Hispanic. Maybe I'm supposed to be called Latinx. Maybe I'm not supposed to call myself a Latin. Maybe I don't look like a Mexican, right? There's a whole series of implicit judgments in all that as to what a Mexican looks like or what a Mexican should be called. And the meaning of calling somebody this may flip. So that's the reason why it's just so important for us to be more forgiving and less judgmental of people's mistakes in the past, and really isolate the people in the past who were doing brutal, nasty things in the context of their times. So.
Thank you. I have a question here from faculty member Nate Piper. Nate's question, and Mr. Piper's question is, do you believe that there are or should be any fundamental human laws or rights or wrongs, or is everything malleable within different contexts?
I tend to be an optimistic curmudgeon. And I think things tend to get better over time. They don't do it in a linear way, but let's say, taking a famous philosopher, John Rawls, who gave you the choice. You can be born into any society at any point in history, but you don't know if you're going to be born a man or a woman or black or white or Hispanic or smart or rich or poor or disabled or whatever. So you have no idea. You're behind a veil of ignorance. And not knowing that, what kind of a society would you design? How would you like to be born at random into India or the US? And I think that's a very good way of thinking about how we should treat one another. And in that context, if you were born a woman, you probably would not have been wanted to be born into the 1900s, when you had no vote, when you couldn't own property, when you needed the permission of your husband to do X, Y, or Z, even in the most advanced societies. People don't realize women didn't get the vote in Switzerland until the 1970s. People don't realize that for women to have the right to vote in the United States, it was illegal for them to protest to ask for the vote, and they were beaten and jailed. You would not want to be born an African American or a Hispanic into this country a century ago, or maybe in the 1960s. Certainly not in the 1800s, and certainly not in the 1600s. So across time, not in a linear fashion, not without major setbacks, I think we're learning how to treat one another in general better. I think you'd rather be born at random into this world today than a century ago, 2 centuries ago, or 5 centuries ago. How should we treat one another? How would you like to be treated? And our understanding of how to treat others, I think, is changing over time. And it's changing in the measure that we begin to understand one another. And part of what scares me about the polarization today is we're creating these groups of everybody over there is bad. Everybody over there is this or that or that. And when you separate people and you create the other, it's much easier to dehumanize and commit atrocities against the others.
Thank you. I have a question here from Senior Connor Downey. Connor's question is, how can you balance the rules or teachings of your religion with your own personal beliefs in the search for right or wrong?
Because I haven't touched on any controversial subjects yet, why don't we chat a little bit about religion. So religions are complicated things. Most religions don't make it. Most religions have gone extinct. So the next time you have a chance to go to a museum, as you're walking through the museum, for centuries, what you're looking at is mostly dead gods. So you're walking through and you see the Egyptian dog god, or you see Zeus, or you see Neptune, or you see Quetzalcoatl, or you see, things that people thought, this is God, or this is one of my gods. And that at that point was the divine, and that's what people were worshiping, and that's what people were dying for. But it turns out that 99% plus of religions have gone extinct. Those religions that don't go extinct are religions that, like various species, evolve and adapt. And again, sometimes it has to do with technology. So one of the interesting questions is, why did Islam spread so quickly across the world in a very short period of time? And part of it had to do with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and part of it had to do with the collapse of, the Roman governance systems and the inefficiency and the corruption and everything else. But it also happened to happen just after the Justinian plague, which killed enormous amounts of people in very short periods of time. And it was a horrible plague, and there were no vaccines. And so along comes this religion that not only is better organized and often has better organized fighters behind it, but it's also a religion that says, to worship this God, you have to wash your hands, your feet, your face 5 times a day before you pray. And so when you're asking for God's protection during a plague, if your religion doesn't bathe more than once a year and the other religion is practicing basic hygiene 5 times a day, on average, guess who gets better protected? When you look at dietary laws, it is not a complete coincidence that there is a ban on pork in parts of the Middle East across various religions. Because, again, there were periods where you had swine flu that killed lots of people, and you had trichinosis that killed a lot of people, and you had pigs, which were pretty dirty animals, living right inside the house. And so one religion bans those pigs, and the other religion lives with those pigs, or accepts those pigs. And I'm not making a judgment on one or the other. I'm simply making the statement, your chances of dying of swine flu or trichinosis or something are very different during a period where you didn't have refrigeration, where you didn't have separate barns for animals, than in the other. So religions adopt and adapt, right? You start with Abraham, and Abraham begets Judaism, and it begets Christianity, and it begets Islam. And Christianity becomes Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Roman, and the Romans speciate into Dominicans and Franciscans and Benedictines, and then Martin Luther comes along, and you get a great big branch of Protestants, and that starts branching into Methodists and Baptists, and last time I looked, there were about 42 different subspecies of Baptists, from the most liberal to the most conservative. And what you're watching is you're watching a belief system adopt and adapt over time. Those religions that ossify, that become fundamentalists, that don't change, that don't interact with science, technology, and learning, often become extinct.
Mr. Enríquez, this is fascinating insight. Thank you very much. I have 1 or 2 more questions here from students that I'd like to get to if we can. This one is from Vishnu Amani, who's a junior. And Vishnu writes, when we talk of isolating the 1% who are truly evil, he has in quotes, how do we actually go about doing that? Suppose, for example, you believe that any excessive violence from police officers is truly evil. What do we do in response to that? How do we act?
So there's 2 ways of doing it. If you take the position every police person is the same, they're all evil and they should all be eliminated, you get a wall that allows no discussion. There's no space, there's no middle ground. It becomes a no man land, and you're on this side or you're on this side. If you start by assuming that most police people do not enjoy going out and shooting and beating people, that most police people actually want to protect the people and want to be respected in their communities and don't want their kids jeered at or attacked at school because their father or mother is a policeman or a policewoman, then it becomes easier to say there are some areas that tend to disproportionately attract people who are prone to violence, who can use their position to exercise violence. And historically, that was actually very valuable. Because if you had an army and you had this conquering mob coming over the wall, somebody who was incredibly violent was actually very useful to defend your fort. In the measure that our societies have become a lot less violent, and our societies have become a lot less violent. And in a short period of time, when I went to college, again, in the dark ages in the 1980s, getting off at the bus station next to the Boston Common was stepping into the combat zone. And the murder rate was about the same in the Boston Common as it is in the nastiest parts of Colombia today. And that has completely changed, which doesn't mean there's not a lot of violence. There's not a lot of abuses. There aren't a lot of awful things. But it does mean that on average, this stuff has come way down. It does mean that we have to take our police forces and patrol them much more carefully and isolate the individuals, call it the 1% or the 2% or the 3%, who enjoy practicing violence, who are sadists, or who abuse their positions. Absolutely no question. But the smartest way to do that is to engage with that. And again, it's fascinating to me how important cell phones have become in that, because all of a sudden each of you has a broadcast studio to say, this is corrupt, this is violent, this is wrong, this has got to stop. And it gives you agency, it gives you power. And that's a good thing, because I think police are going to be a lot more careful about how they treat people. And that's a great thing.
Mr. Enríquez, I have one more student question here. We have only a minute or so, but Theo Cohen, who's a freshman, is asking, you mentioned how support of gay rights over the last 20 years has dramatically increased. Do you think that increased support is genuine, or is this an ingenuine response shaped by fear, by the fear of saying the wrong thing? If so, does this polarization work out in the long run, if in the end people are more tolerant?
No, look, the most awful examples historically are when you can isolate somebody else and say they are the others. And I think movies and films and schools and just exposure to people who have come out of the closet, partly because of AIDS, partly because of culture, partly because of the greater exposure and travel, partly because of tolerance, makes it a whole lot harder to identify your cousin or your uncle or your friend as the other. And I think that normalization of going to school with people who may have different beliefs or customs or desires than you is incredibly helpful, because it makes it much harder to stereotype and isolate and be nasty to people, right? And you go back to Voltaire, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And so it's incredibly important that we question, is it absurd to hate somebody because they're left-handed? Which we did for a long time. Is it absurd to hate somebody who is gay or of a different skin color or of a different religion? Look, 99% of the people who are that are people who are decent human beings. And they're trying to do the right thing. They may not agree with you. treat them as such. Maybe you'll learn something and maybe they'll learn something.
Mr. Enríquez, thank you so much for being with us today. It looks as if Mr. Brennan may have dropped off here. So I just, on behalf of him and me and all of us, I just want to thank you so much for your time this morning, for everything you shared. It gives us so much food for thought and we're grateful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Gentlemen, have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.